Good afternoon, Madam President. I rise in determined opposition to the bill before us. For the people watching at home and those outside, this legislation proposes to eliminate the religious exemption available to parents to allow their children to avoid one or more of the 72 mandatory vaccines that school children are currently required to have to be in school in our state. Our current religious exemption law has existed since 1959, when it was created as part of a program for polio vaccines for school students. It's worth noting that the religious exemption actually predates the mandate and requirement for vaccines. The 1959 law simply enabled local boards of education to set up criteria for vaccines, but the legislators of the day made it absolutely and abundantly clear that a religious exemption was absolutely necessary out of respect for our system of laws and justice and to comply with our state and federal constitutions. I was struck when reading the legislative record and the difference in the tone between then and now. Back in 1959, even the advocates were quite clear that they were against any compulsory requirement, and they were trying to balance their immediate and pressing public health concerns with the fact that they were making laws that affect free American citizens. Trying to find that balance was obviously difficult for them back then, and it clearly is today, as we watch this body and others all across the country and our federal government cross far too many sacred barriers of freedom in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Even the representative of the State Medical Society at the time, Dr. Bergdorf, suggested, quote, a more realistic approach to make available facilities rather than trying to compel people because we want to avoid as much regulation in our personal lives as we can. It wasn't until 1973 that the state created the very first vaccine mandate, and that was for measles. And since then, many, many more have been added. I believe that that statewide mandate was a mistake, and it's also the real issue we should be discussing today. Creating laws for religious or medical exemptions presupposes that the state ever had the right to begin with to create such a mandate. Since crossing that line, things have actually gotten worse. Our state legislature has enacted countless mandates interfering with the freedoms and choices of the very constituents it was created to serve, obviously outside the arena of vaccines. If this body were really attempting to pass good public policy today, they might revisit how the 1959 legislature handled the situation. Those members remembered their responsibility to their constituents and their oath and obligation to protect their rights first, and not as an afterthought, or worse, something to be discarded by this body some 60-odd years later. Madam President, I will be using my time today to illustrate that this proposed legislation is bad policy, it is poorly devised, it will have significant and far-reaching negative consequences. Most importantly, it is fundamentally wrong, immoral, and I would say even anti-American. I have done a ton of research and spoke with dozens of people on all sides of this issue over the last several years when this first became an issue of concern in this body. Candidly, I will tell you, I've learned a lot over these recent years. I would say that I've become more skeptical of the vaccine industry and the process that leads to vaccines being developed and ultimately approved. But with that said, I would not consider myself to be remotely anti-vaccine. I had all my shots as a kid, although that was a much more limited number back then. And I would still say that in most every case, the benefits of vaccines, particularly proven ones, far outweighs the dangers. And there is absolutely no disputing that vaccines are a miracle that have saved millions of human lives. I am genuinely thankful for that. However, we must also acknowledge that there are risks and well-known side effects, even death, as there are with all medications. This cannot be ignored, even if they are small or rare. Some might say that those risks are the exact reason why the religious exemption must be retained. I would go even farther and say that it doesn't matter one bit. If we are truly free citizens and the government has no right to inject anything into us without our permission, risk or no risk. I don't care, Madam President, if there is someday a vaccine or a shot for immortality. It will still be up to me if I want it. But make no mistake, anyone watching this bill is not about vaccines at all. It is about the government power, greatly expanding the role and reach of government into our personal lives. The same term used back in 1959 by the advocates of the vaccine mandate. And should make each of us wonder whether we are still free citizens living in anything that even resembles America. I was on a Zoom call, Madam President, a few nights ago, right after this bill passed the House of Representatives, and there were several hundred people on that call. Mostly moms who were completely devastated to learn that they will no longer be allowed to make health choices for their own children. And not only that, they have to consider how they are going to provide for their children's education. Will they have to quit their job? Can they work if they now must homeschool? So many questions. Talking with them, hearing their desperation, just thinking about the pain inflicted upon them by this careless body makes me angry. Madam President, I have a lot to say on this bill, but I want to begin my assessment by talking about what I started with, which is that this is just bad policy overall, and that it will indeed have far-reaching and negative consequences. Let's in fact start by pointing out that this bill is actually based on what I would consider to be a phony health crisis that never existed in the first place. Those who are in favor of this legislation have not shown us why there is a need to act. For what outbreak? There have been 2 cases of measles in Fairfield recently. That's hardly a pandemic and no reason to change our current law. It turns out that it was a result of a child under 1 year old who's too young to even get the measles vaccine, and the family went overseas and contracted it. The other case is another member of the same household. There were also 3 cases of mumps at UConn in December of 2019. I Googled to try and find out all of the cases that have shown up in the last decade or so. And there are similar situations, but no tragedies, just extremely rare cases like these. There is no outbreak. It also makes it completely clear that this has nothing to do with the declining vaccination rates as a result of the religious exemption that were mentioned by the introducer of the bill. I'm told that we as a state are at a rate of 95%. In fact, I heard someone say 96.2% of our students being fully vaccinated, and that makes us in the top 5 in the entire country. Can you imagine that, Madam President? That Connecticut is actually in the top 5 of something good for a change. I do want to talk about the numbers, though. The numbers that I have been relying on are what I heard during the House debate. So, Madam President, through you, I'd like to ask the proponent of the bill just to help me confirm some of these numbers.
Please proceed, sir.
Through you, Madam President, are there, in fact, detailed numbers about the number of students that are not fully vaccinated?
Senator Abrams.
Madam President, I can't speak to what was said in the House debate, so I'm questioning how I would answer that.
Senator Sampson.
Well, thank you, Madam President. My question has nothing to do with what was in the House debate. I just simply mentioned that I have been relying on those numbers since that's all I have. I want to know if there are, in fact, detailed numbers that this government can offer people interested as far as the number of students that are not fully vaccinated, how many have a medical exemption, how many have a religious exemption, and so on. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Abrams.
Through you, Madam President, there is information from the Department of Public Health as to how many students have medical exemptions and how many students have religious exemptions. Through you.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I don't want to keep asking questions over and over when I think it's pretty clear what I'm trying to find out. Through you, Madam President, can I have those numbers? Is the proponent of the bill prepared to let us know what the numbers are? It's not a lot of data. It's simply how many people are not fully vaccinated and how many of them have religious exemptions and how many of them have medical exemptions. Through you, Madam President.
Senator, thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Abrams.
Thank you, Madam President. So the question is how many students currently have religious exemptions and how many currently have medical exemptions, if I am correct. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Yes, that is correct. I would like to know the total number of not fully vaccinated students and how many of them have a medical exemption and how many of them have a religious exemption.
Senator Abrams.
Thank you, Madam President. Just a moment and I will look at that information for you.
Senator Duff.
Thank you, Madam President. Senate will stand at ease while Senator Abrams is looking for the information.
Senate will indeed stand at ease. Senator Abrams.
Thank you, Madam President. For the 2019-20 school year, there was a total of 8,328 students with religious exemptions, 1,156 students with medical exemptions, and a total population of 574,181 students.
Thank you.
Through you.
Thank you, Senator Abrams. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. And I appreciate the proponent coming up with that information. To me, that's something that should have been handy because it is a very critical part of this discussion. And it was also missing one of the most important elements, which is I had also asked the total number of students that are not fully vaccinated in our Connecticut schools. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Abrams.
If I understand the question correctly, I will say that those students who are found to be non-compliant, that information happens right at the beginning of the school year. That's noted in the fall. And those students are worked with, as I explained before, to come into compliance throughout the school year. So I don't know that that number is readily available. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I presume that information is as readily available as is the information that was already provided since it was from 2019 and 2020 school year. Again, I'm not going to keep going down this road. It's quite clear that I need to do my own research, which I did, and I want to thank the proponent for sharing the numbers, which are somewhat similar to the numbers that I found published on the state websites that provide this information. I'm a little surprised that the numbers are different in some respect. But what I'm told is that I had a number of 567,198 students in our public and private schools, not including college and universities. And I did have 7,645 religious exemptions versus 8,328. So your numbers are a little higher, but I find the number for vaccine religious exemptions to be much, much higher than what is published online on the DPH website. The number that Representative Steinberg referred to on the House floor during the debate was 30,000 as the number of students that are in our school system that are not currently vaccinated. He said approximately 1 to 2,000 with the medical exemption. I've heard numbers from 1,000, which is what he originally said, and then I've just heard the good senator say 1,156. And I heard someone else this morning tell me 1,800. So I don't know what the number actually is, but I will trust that it is between 1 and 2,000. I'll just say, Madam President, I think it's completely absurd that we could be here having this conversation without having these numbers all agreed to and well resolved prior to final passage in the state Senate of what will become a law that will affect thousands of people. Just doing the math here, I want to just point something out, which is that if there are indeed 574,000 students in the state, and only 8,328 of them are exercising a religious exemption, that is a very, very small population. We talked earlier that our current vaccination compliance rate is 96.2%. If we eliminated every other person outside of people that had religious exemptions and medical exemptions, and we actually took care of the non-compliant population, do you know, Madam President, that our rate of vaccinations in the state would be 99.98%? Anyone at home can do this themselves. Take 8,328, take the full 2,000 of medical exemptions, since we don't know what the number is, and divide it into 574,000, and you get less, much less than 2%. It's about 1.5%. This is what we're talking about, Madam President. This shows, I want to also point out that the term non-compliant is referring to anyone that is missing even one vaccine. So a student could have every vaccine, whether they have a religious exemption or not, which is, I think, a misnomer that folks that have religious exemptions don't have any vaccines at all. I think a great many of them have most vaccines, and some may have all vaccines. I've spoken with parents who have expressed their desire to have a religious exemption simply because they're concerned about making choices in the future about what vaccines their children may get, not that their kids are not already vaccinated. I think this proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Madam President, that not fully vaccinated students, even if it is a problem, it doesn't lie with religious exemptions or medical exemptions. It lies with students that are just not compliant. And as I said, this bill has very little to do with vaccines anyway. My understanding is that while these actual numbers seem awful hard and mysterious to come up with, my understanding is that the Department of Public Health does in fact know what schools across our state do in fact have the high non-compliance rates. So wouldn't it make more sense? I mean, if we were really concerned as a legislature about increasing vaccine participation, wouldn't you simply address the schools with a high number of non-compliant students? You would go to those schools and you would try and educate and encourage people to get vaccines. We could be addressing that now. We could have been addressing that for the last 4 or 5 years that this legislation has been floating around this building. It definitely seems a lot simpler to me that if your goal is really just to increase the participation rate of vaccines among school kids, maybe an ad campaign or some interaction with the schools in question is what is really needed. And it makes me wonder why that is not being done if this is such an urgent crisis. Just a reminder, 8,000 religious exemptions into 574,000 students is less than 0.2%. That's 99.93 something. Not to mention the whole idea of removing children from school, either now or in the future, is frankly just stupid. I mean, these kids are still going to exist. They're going to go to the mall. They're going to go to other public places. They're going to go to the library. They're going to be and interact with their friends. Nothing is accomplished by this legislation except depriving some children of the education that our state constitution entitles them to. Speaking of which, one of the things every person is entitled to is a right to petition their government. I am very sorry to say that I am embarrassed for this institution. I have always taken this job extremely seriously. I respect people with different views. I love to debate politics. I like the idea that I can come here and disagree with Senator Duff or Senator Looney on any issue, and we can do it respectfully, and we can do it because we're free citizens who get to decide what we think for ourselves. But this body has done things in this last year which I believe are beyond the pale. The fact that I'm standing in this room and most of the members of the Senate are not allowed to be in here is ridiculous. If we have such a health crisis, then we shouldn't be here at all. It's just that simple. It's all or nothing. It's not we're going to just rig the rules so that only a few people can be in the room at the time and we can monitor the situation. And that's much how the legislative process has gone through this entire session. The public hearing for this particular bill before us went through the Public Health Committee public hearing process, but this year that was confined to an online Zoom-only public hearing. And if you've followed my comments at all since the beginning of this legislative session, you'll know that I have great objections to that. I think that it has benefited in some cases because you have people that have never participated in our process before actually participating now because it's more convenient for them to get on Zoom. But simultaneous to that, you are also telling people that do not have the technology. There's a percentage of the population of this state who has no internet access. How are they supposed to participate in a public hearing on Zoom? How are they supposed to petition the government if they can't come to the building? Worse than that, Madam President, 1,931 people signed up to testify on this proposed legislation, the vast majority in opposition. I mean, I don't think anyone, even the proponents, could argue that it was 10-1 and probably more. There were 236 people ultimately who testified. 226 of them were opposed to this bill. Only 10 were in favor of it. About 200 people were skipped. So that means 1,497, virtually 1,500 people were told, sorry, you do not get to exercise your right to petition your government. That public hearing, yes, it would have went on for several days. Whoopee. That's what we should be doing. In fact, I would say almost every bill that comes through here, no matter how minor it is, ought to get 60 hours worth of conversation. The number of things that come back here year after year for us to massage them back into form because they were passed in a rush. I can think of things off the top of my head, including, how much we're charging local, Italian clubs for their liquor permits. That's the kind of chaos that happens when you rush through things and you don't give the public an opportunity to even know what is happening. There are thousands of people, Madam President, outside of this building today. If this was a legitimate exercise of their liberty and their right to petition their government, they would be allowed in this building. The noise that they're making that we can hear, thank God, would be 50 times louder if it was outside these doors of this chamber. Imagine if those people were allowed in this room and they sat in these chairs above us. How much impact they would have. But instead, they're being forced to stay outside and not participate in laws that will affect them and their children. I brought along with me a few selected pieces of testimony, Madam President, And I was going to read them, but the staff warned me. They said, no, Senator, if you start reading the testimony here, someone's going to stop you and say, you can't read that. And I understand that those are our rules, Madam President. But I just want to point out that it's facetious that 1,500 people were censored, and it's pretty clear I would not be allowed to read even a half a dozen pieces of their testimony. I also want to point out that I was hand-delivered a huge, huge petition from people just in my district. We're not allowed to have props in here, but I thought I might get away at least with just waving around some stuff and saying, look, you know, I got this petition. Thousands of people from my district signed a petition against this bill.
Duly noted, Senator. Duly noted.
Am I being scolded, Madam President? I will refrain.
In the nicest way, Senator.
Thank you very much. In the testimony provided by the people that did get to testify and submitted it in writing, there are some extremely important points made. So I want to just go through these, and I want to just double down on making the point that these are their points. This is not me up here arguing, although I am clearly taking what they've said very seriously since I want to include it in my remarks today. Number one, there is no current dangerous infection disease outbreak in Connecticut, and there has not been one in 60 years since we've had the religious exemption in effect. There is no study or other evidence that links unvaccinated school children to the spread of disease. Simply put, non-vaccinated people are not a threat to others, and particularly to other people that do have vaccines. That there is no study or evidence proving that removing children holding a religious exemption from school will improve any health outcomes for students or will reduce the spread of disease in the future. They point out that there is no compelling state interest in removing a constitutionally protected religious right. They point out that there is no compelling state interest in removing a constitutionally protected right or entitlement to public education. And there's no compelling state interest in removing a constitutionally protected right to equal protection. The amendment adding grandfathering proves there's no compelling interest or health crisis to validate or support this bill. And don't worry, Madam President, I will be back after this list to talk a little bit about the grandfathering that is now included in this bill. They point out also that the data on school exemptions is inaccurate, and no bill should be based on false data. There were no increased deaths or health concerns historically in populations when the vaccination rate was much lower than it is now. And the vast majority of states, 46 out of 50, currently permit religious exemptions. They point out that this bill will cause severe emotional distress to students who will be removed from their friends, sports programs, music and performing arts, student government, and will affect the futures in a very negative and consequential way of kids who plan to attend college or go to trade schools. They also provided a lot of scientific information, which I am not going to get into. I will leave that in the hands of Senator Summers. I know she knows a lot more about the details about vaccines themselves. But I did put together a top 10 list of points that they made about vaccines that I found to be persuasive. So number 1 out of 10, the number of vaccines that are mandated in the state has steadily risen over the years. From beginning in 1971, there were 4 vaccines mandated, 13 in 1981, 21 in 1996. But 72 doses today, and I know there's some people that might argue and say it's 54. I say, okay, whoopee. I wonder how many of our neighbors even know that there are that many vaccines. It's not just measles, mumps, and rubella and a few other things. It's 72 doses. Number 2, people who have received certain types of live virus vaccines, which measles, mumps, and rubella are, can shed the disease. In other words, when you give them the vaccine, they can actually infect other people with measles, mumps, and rubella, and it has happened. There have been outbreaks. Number 3, there have been outbreaks of whooping cough, mumps, measles, and chickenpox in what are documented to be 100% vaccinated populations. I had to look it up when I read this, but I went right to the CDC website. I'll be happy to share the link with any of my colleagues. But it's right there on the CDC website, and you can verify it yourself. Just type in outbreaks in 100% vaccinated populations, and you will get the same results that I did. Number 4, children that have active HIV infections, children that have active Hep B infections are granted privacy protections under our current law, and they can attend school. But this bill is not going to afford the same protection to those kids who are perfectly healthy, but they have a religious exemption. Number 5, vaccines are pharmaceutical products that have listed and proven side effects, even death and permanent injury, but they have no legal liability. I wonder how many people watching this and understanding this bill for the first time even knew that. The government, the federal government, has even set up a system to pay off claims of those folks who've experienced injuries from vaccines. And to this day, this program was set up, I think, around 20 years ago. They have paid out, can you believe this, $4.5 billion, which I believe was about the state budget of Connecticut in the 80s. That's how much money we're talking about. That is 9 billions. That's how much money has been paid from vaccine out of the vaccine injury fund. Number 6, vaccines do not go through the same safety testing that other drugs do, and they sometimes gain approval in months rather than 4 or 5 years, like a lot of other drugs end up having to go through trials for. Number 7, vaccine manufacturers were granted immunity from liability in 1986 because they were losing far too much money from product liability lawsuits on the injuries and death children suffered from vaccines, thus the creation of the injury fund that I just told you about. Number 8, as a result, a side effect, it could be argued that vaccine manufacturers have a reduced incentive to develop and market safe products because they have no liability for what happens if injuries are caused. Number 9, there is a somewhat obvious argument that I don't hear very often, which is that if you trust vaccines, which I imagine the people that are promoting this bill trust vaccines, and as do I, then why would anyone care whether someone else is vaccinated? This is a whole conversation in itself, given what's going on with the subject of the pandemic. It's like suggesting somehow that the only way that you can stay dry in a rainstorm is if everyone else has an umbrella. And number 10, finally, if it is so important to have everyone in school vaccinated, then serious question, I hope people are listening, why does this bill not cover everyone in school? We already ascertained there's 567,000 students in our public schools, not including college. But there's also 50,000 teachers, not mandated under this legislation. Another 26,000 administrators, not mandated under this legislation. And that doesn't include guidance counselors, librarians, the custodian, and the myriad of other people that end up in a school on any given day. That's a lot of people. Way more than the 0.02% of religious exemptions, which is 8,000 people. You know, we make virtually everyone who even walks by a school a mandated reporter. So what's the difference? And as I mentioned before, why just schools? Children go to a lot of places besides school. So those are all points that I heard in the testimony from people that came before this legislature to have their voices heard. I think it would have been a lot better if they were able to say all of those things to my colleagues themselves. But I'm glad that I was able to at least share their views with you. And I'm sorry to say that many of these points are being ignored. The main thrust of the testimony, though, revolves around one thing, which I think is the most important and key point. when you start talking about the policy here, and I promise to talk about more than just policy, I plan on talking about principle. But when you're talking about policy, they come back to the same thing all the time, Madam President, and that is there are no grounds to act. And those in favor of this bill, and I've been listening, they have yet to explain and document where the problem is. I said I was going to talk about grandfathering, so let's do that. I jokingly said to a colleague this morning, Madam President, that grandfathering that now appears in this bill is what I would use if I was in a courtroom as Exhibit A. Exhibit A, Madam President, grandfathering. Nothing in the whole bill proves that there are no grounds to act, like the fact that this bill contains a significant and broad grandfathering clause. My understanding is that it includes every child in our public school system, K through 12 and college, who will have a religious exemption on file before this bill is signed into law. It does not include pre-K and daycare, which is a whole other discussion. But what an incredible admission that this is bad policy. It makes every argument that the proponents have made for the last several years about how we have to do this. This is a health crisis. Oh my God, we have to do something. It just throws that out the window. If you think this is good policy, then why would you ever suggest that it should not apply to everyone immediately? And more importantly, equally. Whatever happened to the conversation we have in this building all day, every day about the word equity? If there was really a danger to public health posed by the religious exemption, again, ignoring the much larger problem of the kids that are simply non-compliant with vaccines, then how does one justify grandfathering all the kids in school? You just can't do it. You can't do it, Madam President. It's prima facie evidence of my very first point that this bill is based on a phony premise to begin with. And you can add that to a long list of proof that there is no pressing public health need. And you can add that to another good question. If it is so important to get our number up, and those in favor of the bill are so concerned about covering everyone, why aren't those teachers and faculty covered? How could anyone take your serious concern for public health argument seriously with holes in your policy like that? Now, I suspect the reason why the grandfathering is in the bill, Madam President, is because of the goal of this bill is not public health at all, and providing these exceptions makes it a whole lot easier to pass it into law. Certainly, teachers and faculty are not immune from measles and mumps and rubella and everything else. They can contract and spread illness just like everyone else, and certainly the same way kids can. But they do indeed have a much louder voice, don't they? And they have a much louder voice in this building. Grandfathering the current students in this bill also helps pass it too, since it solves the immediate problem for the many, many parents that already have religious exemptions right now, and they will be grandfathered. So it makes them kind of go away. Apparently not, though, because there are still thousands of them outside this building today concerned about the actions of this body. Speaking with them, I will point out that the subject of vaccines hardly came up. The comments that they made to me were about the government taking away their individual right to bodily autonomy. That's what they said to me. So maybe it solves the problem of the mountain of lawsuits that would be generated by applying this toxic law to these populations immediately. But those lawsuits will still inevitably come. Lawsuits about religious freedom, equal protection, and the right to be secure in our persons. And I'm not just talking about the United States Constitution either, Madam President. Our own state constitution provides many of these provisions. Article 1, Section 20, no person shall be denied the equal protection of the law, nor be subjected to segregation or discrimination in the exercise or enjoyment of his civil or political rights, and I would argue based on our Constitution that includes a public education, because of religion, race, color, ancestry, or national origin. Seems pretty straightforward to me, Madam President, that this body cannot create laws that discriminate against access to government programs and benefits based on religion. I believe that's the reason why the Constitution has that language in it. Imagine, if you will, a law being passed by this body that said someone cannot have a driver's license or become a licensed real estate agent based on their religious beliefs. You would never, ever let that go. Or saying non-vaccinated people, they're prohibited from voting. That is not a stretch from what this bill before us does, Madam President. There will be lawsuits. Lawsuits from parents demanding the state pay for their children's education per the extremely, very clear wording of our state constitution. How many millions is that going to add up to? Ultimately, to be the responsibility of my constituents, taxpayers in the state. Article 8, Section 1, there shall always be free public elementary and secondary schools in the state. And lawsuits not just to the state, Madam President, but also to municipalities. There's been a lot of conversation about special needs kids and how our laws put the obligation to pay for their education on towns. If they no longer can be provided that education, that is a lawsuit waiting to happen. I was told that grandfathering will reduce the number of students with current religious exemptions that will be refused access to services is going to drop from the 8,000 number. Once this bill is passed and the grandfathering takes effect also, that is going to only affect around 800 children. And that number is just another number that was provided to me. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's supposed to reflect the number of kids that are in pre-K or daycare, because they are going to be immediately affected by this. So what about them? And what about their parents? Madam President, I have a question for the proponent of the bill, as a matter of fact.
Thank you, Senator Abrams. Prepare yourself. Please proceed, sir.
Through you, Madam President. So this bill is going to grandfather K through 12 in college, but not daycare and pre-K students. So my question is, does this mean that those children will not be able to continue attending daycare or pre-K once this bill is signed into law by the governor? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Abrams.
Through you, Madam President, this bill does provide a grace period and also an opportunity to obtain a medical exemption if that is warranted. In addition, they can have time to catch up on their schedule of vaccinations, as we discussed before. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. And I appreciate the answer, although I believe that the good chairwoman of the Public Health Committee made it sound like there were multiple options, and there's really only one option, which is no, they can absolutely come back, but that would mean that they have to become compliant by September of 2022. I don't know if you referred to that as a grace period, because there's certainly no grace period if you still want to exercise your religious exemption. You are just out at that point. And Madam President, forgive me, I was being clever when I asked the question, because there's no good answer. You know, I asked the question, what happens to these kids? Well, if the answer is no and they can stay in school, well, that means they get to only stay till September of 22, and only if they get their vaccines. So they're out after that. Or the answer could have been yes, those kids can't come back, in which case we're just throwing kids out of daycare. But in the case that it is no, and those kids can in fact stay till September of next year, aren't we once again undermining the premise of the bill, which is trying to up the vaccination rate? So not only did we grandfather most of the kids, we semi-grandfathered the other kids too. And why are they being treated differently? Why are the parents of kids who have children in daycare have to deal with different set of circumstances than children or parents of children in K through 12? And what about parents that have both situations? You can imagine the complications. My understanding, Madam President, is in order for you to be eligible to go to school once this bill becomes law, you need to either be current on vaccines, or you need to have your religious exemption on file predating the bill becoming law, and you need to be enrolled in school. So through you, Madam President, a question: what is the definition of enrolled? And the reason why I'm asking is because I have a great many number of parents contacting me who are very curious because they're wondering right now about what is going to happen, and they can enroll their kids in the next fall semester. And this is critical information for them. Madam President, I beg of the Chairman of the Public Health Committee to please give me good news.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Abrams.
Thank you, Madam President. Whether or not a child is enrolled in school would be determined by the school or the local Board of Ed. Thank you.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. So that is up to the local Board of Education. There is no statutory determination of who is enrolled and who is not. I just want to confirm that through you, Madam President, and I'm sorry to make you get up and down. I have a few more questions, so be ready.
Be forewarned. Senator Abrams.
Thank you, Madam President. I am forewarned. Yes, enrollment is determined by the school.
Senator Sampson.
All right, that's excellent news. Hopefully there will be schools and boards of education across this state who will take a very loose determination of what they consider to be enrolled to allow these parents to accommodate their kids and for those children to receive their public education. I'm curious to know if a student unenrolls from school, like there are many kids right now that have been taken out of school by their parents because of COVID. Would those children, if they have a religious exemption, qualify the grandfathering clause, and if they wanted to re-enroll in school again in the future? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Abrams.
Students would need to be enrolled in school.
Senator Sampson.
And thank you, Madam President. So I take that to mean that if they are not enrolled in school when this bill is signed into law, they are not going to be able to re-enroll and go back to school.
Senator Abrams.
It is my understanding of the bill that students need to be enrolled with a religious exemption in order to continue to retain that. If a student is enrolled with a religious exemption at the time of this bill, but then leaves school, they would be able to come back. But if they are not enrolled in school at the time of this bill, then they would not be enrolled in school with the religious exemption. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the answer. I find that extremely disturbing because, as I mentioned before, simply having a religious exemption does not imply that kids do not have some number of vaccinations. And not having a religious exemption does not imply that the kid is not in school. So, I mean, both of those things lead me to believe that you could have a situation where next year, children that have the full set of vaccines but a religious exemption on file would not be able to go back to school because they were not enrolled. But some kids who are not compliant or have no vaccines but they don't have a religious exemption on file can enroll back in school. That makes absolutely no sense to me, Madam President, but that is the facts of this bill we just figured out. So it creates a follow-up question for me, Madam President. Can a parent remove a religious exemption on file so that their child would be allowed to go to school as non-compliant? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Abrams.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me clear up some misunderstanding about students who are considered out of compliance. Those students are required to have vaccinations to attend school as anyone is. If this bill passes, they will need to have received 1 dose of the vaccine and continue on a catch-up schedule, or have a written document from a healthcare provider that explains that they have an appointment and that they are scheduled to receive those immunizations. Most students who are non-compliant will catch up by the end of the school year or be on a schedule to do so. That is very different than someone with a religious exemption who has no intention of catching up on those schedules. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President, and I appreciate those remarks, and I don't disagree with the letter of the law. However, the current law, I would point out, says that you need to be vaccinated or have a religious or medical exemption on file to go to school, but we all know that that's not what's happening. The number 30,000, whether it's an accurate to the final decimal point number or not, is a real number of children in our school systems that are not compliant. So nothing tells me that that's going to change simply because we get rid of the religious exemption. I want to just ask a couple of questions about college students, for example. What about college students transferring from another state, through you, Madam President? Would a religious exemption on file follow them? I'm referring to, of course, what was Amendment G in the House, which is now made part of this bill, which allows religious exemptions to follow a student through their school career. But I'm asking specifically about someone who's in another state entirely, has a religious exemption, and then they come to Connecticut and they want to go to UConn, for example. Would they be allowed to go to school?
Senator Abrams.
Through you, Madam President, my understanding is that if they have been enrolled with a religious exemption, they would be allowed to continue and retain that religious exemption if they went to higher education.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Bear with me a quick second because I do want to just look at that amendment very quickly. I will just point the gentle lady to in Amendment G, which since there is no new file copy of this bill, that's what I'm using. But Section G says that the transferring applies on line 7 from one public or private school in the state to another private or public school in the state under the jurisdiction of either the same or different local board of education, etc. So I'm pretty sure that the letter of this law says that if you are trying to go to UConn and you have a religious exemption from another state, you are not eligible to transfer your religious exemption. I don't know if the gentlelady wants to disagree with me or not. She's welcome to treat that as a question, but that's how I'm reading the bill, and it sends a horrible message, Madam President, a horrible message. It says to students that want to come to UConn from other states that if they have a religious exemption, got it. I know I'm not welcome. I can't believe that the proponents think that any of this language in this bill and these effects that it's going to have on real people and real families are okay. I just can't. Even to the point of extending this elimination of the religious exemption to private schools. A private school is a school that parents pay for on top of the mountain of taxes, the burden of taxes that they pay. They can't even pay out of pocket to avoid this because this body sees fit to add this to private schools. All right, so that's the policy. Forgive me, Madam President, I think I did enough damage to the policy and have made it quite clear that there are, in fact, negative consequences when this bill becomes law. So I want to just talk about the moral and philosophical issue, which is what the reason I'm standing here for, because this is what I care about, Madam President. I'll start by saying, what a mess. I mean, is there any doubt at this point that this bill is based entirely on a false premise? I mean, I proved that the religious exemption folks make up less than 0.2%. So that's not the problem. And we are not including the other people in the schools that amount to maybe 10, 15%. We are not addressing the non-compliant. So you can't tell me that this is about fixing our 96% rate and moving it up, because it's not. Because the most you could ever move it if you got everyone with a religious exemption currently, all 8,000 some odd people, to agree and change their mind tomorrow and say, well, we're going to get vaccinated, it only moves the needle less than 0.02. That's it. How can you say that this bill is for that purpose? There is, in fact, no reason for this legislation to be before us from a policy standpoint. And there is no doubt about the significant and negative impact it's going to occur on the people that we represent. There's just no doubt about that. So why exactly is this bill here? I submit to you that this bill is before us for the purpose of advancing an ugly and anti-American ideology that is designed to replace our historical and divinely inspired system of government that recognizes individual liberty as the most paramount thing, and that the people, us people, that serve in government do so as servants and not as lords of the people we represent. This is an ugly piece of legislation, Madam President. And let me say this clearly. If you listen to nothing else I say, if the government will now have the power to force someone to stick a needle in their arm and put chemicals in their body against their will, or even make it a condition to go to public school, then we have no rights at all. After all, what is next after that? What requirements will the government place upon us next as a condition for participating in society? There's been a lot of talk about COVID-19 passports, and I know people, even people who are adamantly in favor of the vaccine, they shudder when the term COVID-19 passport comes up because they recognize just how dangerous that is, that we will be segregating our society. This policy right before us today is way worse. And the reason why it's worse is because there's not even a pandemic. There's not even a hint of a pandemic regarding the mandatory vaccines that we're talking about here. And as a result of this law, many, many innocent children will be denied a public education or even the right to a private one. And some for something as minor as not having a flu shot. Or maybe even they have all of their vaccines, but they want to reserve the right to make a decision about one in the future. Where exactly does this end, Madam President? State-sanctioned music, food? You've already had your allotted amount of red meat this month, Senator. Does anyone listening like the idea of losing their freedom to make their own choices about any of this? How many people in this legislature who plan to vote in favor of this bill have personally uttered the words, "My body, my choice"? It's a simple question and should give you the answer about how you should vote on this bill. Who owns our bodies anyway? Is it us or is it the government? Since I've been here, Madam President, this bill may be the purest example of the difference in the ideologies between the political parties, the competing philosophies that our country as a whole seems to be wrestling with. Will we retain our respect for individual liberty and self-governance, or will we lose it because of the politics of fear and big government promises? We are not guaranteed perfect safety or freedom, no matter who is in power or what laws are passed. And those that promise safety do so at the expense of others, and always for their own benefit. If you accept the premise that you are supposed to follow this code of self-sacrifice for the public good, you are also accepting the premise that none of us have individual rights, choices, or freedoms, since anytime your choice or my choice conflicts with those making decisions like this, the public, we will be the ones who sacrifice. The history of mankind is littered with societies that have taken this path and the carnage and human suffering that has resulted. I will spare you the details. The alternative is the system that we are slowly but surely losing, the American system, which guarantees every citizen's protection for the rights they were born with, and a system of government where the people who make the laws don't answer to a king or to themselves, but to the people. Think about it. How do we want to live? Do we want to live in a free society where the government has the job to protect our right to live as we see fit, to pursue our own happiness, and we have the power to correct the course that we're on if we choose to? Or do we want a society that mirrors the bill before us, where the government is the only thing that's truly free and the citizens have to beg for permission? Do we still live in a country and state where you can claim to own your own body? Not if this bill becomes law. I am deeply saddened, Madam President, on how far our culture has declined. I'm actually angry. I hope that's coming through in my comments today. That this bill would receive support from any elected member of the legislature in either party. My gut reaction, Madam President, just standing here before this body and wishing that everyone was in the room, is to ask my fellow legislators, just who exactly do you think you are? What makes you think you have the right to tell anyone else what is right for them and that they must comply with your views or they are to be restricted from participation in our society? I have another question, Madam President. Will you take responsibility for what happens when you pass this bill? What are you going to do to make sure every child still receives an education? What are you going to say to the parents of the first child that is vaccine injured or worse? In the end, the most important question that remains is about the type of society we want to live in. This country was founded on the ideal that freedom was and is more important than government managing our lives. Freedom of choice is the moral answer. All other options, like this bill, require force, one group against another. And for me personally, I don't believe that any one person or this body has the right to tell others how to live, not on the subject of religion, not on anything, not on sexual preference, and definitely not about on their health or what they choose to eat or how they take care of themselves or what is injected into their bodies or the bodies of their children. And Madam President, using the government to achieve such a goal is even worse. Basically, no one, not any person, and not the Connecticut state government has the right to tell anyone how to live. I say no, Madam President, not in America. Thank you.